All right, all right, can you hear me okay? Yes. Awesome. So hi, I'm Rachel Presser, yes, aka the Toad Lady of Sonic Toad Media, and I am here to talk about point-and-click adventure games and empathy. And so first, just a quick shameless plug to get out of the way. So Sonic Toad Media Consulting is basically how I pay for everything related to game making. I'm mostly known for my business of game stuff and helping people with taxes, marketing, all those unsexy parts of running a game studio. And that's what, helps fund my narrative design pursuits and game commentary. So, to get down to brass tacks, we're suffering, a worldwide empathy deficit. Obviously, fellow Americans in the room know what I'm speaking of, but it's not uniquely an American problem. If you've noticed, there's been a rise of fascism across the freaking world. It's not just a uniquely American problem, but there definitely is a more pernicious variety of it in America, which I'm about to literally get into. When I was looking up just random Google queries, and then I found this on Quora one night about why does American society lack empathy? And then I'm actually going to get into two different concepts on here just for a little bit. Namely, those things that I highlighted on this particular post is that a little bit on my background. I was a professional tax accountant for 10 years. I'm still licensed, no longer practice. And I highlighted this point here because this person's trying to say that Americans have empathy because they give to charity. No, writing a check does not give you absolution. Let me just say that as someone who did taxes for extremely wealthy people for some time. So that's why I put a what up there. But the other thing, too, is that people tend to think of empathy just as being kind, which it can be. So we're going to delve into what does empathy actually entail. And the main thing that people, get it confused with is just being kind, which just being decent is part of being empathetic. But the main reason why a lot of people are lacking empathy is that they're not aware of the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of others, and they're not making a good faith effort to imagine that lived experience. And so, yes, I live up to my name. Of course, I'm going to explain this with toads. How else? So I'm going to get more into this on the next slide, but there's three distinct types of empathy that especially come into play for interactive media, like games. But then you also do see this present in other mediums like film, anything else with a more visual type of element. In that you have something like cognitive empathy, which is where you're intentionally taking on another person's point of view. So, case in point, if you're traveling to a foreign country and you're worried about, if something that you're doing that may be normal in your home country, like for instance, when Dave was giving his talk and said, oh, the two fingers in the air, that's actually rude over here, it wouldn't mean anything back in America. That's like a very, slight innocuous example, but it's the same concept that you are worried about, how other people could take an action or words of yours. Hence that one red frog standing out from all those green ones. And then there's two different types of emotional empathy, where the exam. So actually, I quoted a paper all about game design and empathy. If you're interested in reading more on this topic, I put it up there in that title bar. And the example that this paper gave for parallel and reactive emotional empathies is when you see someone, like you're still in school, and then you see another classmate who's being bullied. A parallel empathy type of reaction would be if, you're also feeling, scared, or you're feeling stressed, watching them undergo this. Well, reactive would be angry, because parallel means you see those two frogs that look very similar on similar plants. You're experiencing pretty much the same thing that other person is experiencing, while reactive means it's going to be different than how that affected person is currently feeling. And so then the big question, of course, is, so where do games, especially adventure games, compared to other types, come in for this? Well, obviously, you have that experiential component, which games offer, the better than pretty much anything else, because movies can be obviously, a very like deep medium that, that people identify with, but it's still a relatively passive experience. It's not the same as playing a game where you actually have to sit down, play it, you act as the player's agent, and then, and so you're actually really deeply getting into the choices that you're making and watching how they play out. So that's what makes games so uniquely poised to help cultivate empathy when it's so badly needed. But then it comes in with what actually defines experiential. Excuse me 1 second. So I picked out one of my favorite screenshots from the game Donut County because I'm a columnist slash content producer over at Game With Your Brain. Go check out the site. We got lots of awesome commentary about all kinds of games up, and a new podcast which I'm hosting. Yeah, I gotta get that out of the way. And so I recently did a piece about Donut County and about what actually defines an experiential game, because this game gets into gentrification. It's a big allegory for it, and how you're just playing as a raccoon controlling this hole, going around picking things up, but it's actually meant to be like an allegory for displacing people. And then it's been dubbed as a very personal and experiential type of game, but then there's some critics who say, oh, well, aren't all games experiential because you're technically doing this? And so that's a whole other debate we do not have. Yeah, I only have 30 minutes on stage, so let's save that discussion for the pub. Because one thing that I think a lot of game developers simply never got the memo for is that we do have a lot of power with this medium. I don't know if you can really see the text on the screen that well. It's highlighting. This is just a little snippet from E. McNeil, who writes for Gama Sutra, a couple other publications in gaming. He just has a quote from Jonathan Blow about how millions of people, buying these games, it's actually having an effect on their mental health. This is huge. You actually need to sit down and think about this. To make a little allegory with this, way back when I was still more or less transitioning careers, when I was still co-heading Himalaya and then working my shitty job at the tax office I couldn't stand. Yeah, more about that later. When I was working this shitty tax office job I couldn't stand, and I was taking a writing class at the Gotham Writers Workshop, and the professor said something that still stuck me to this day, and then I later lived it, when he says, oh, people, like to smack talk writing. They don't think it's important. It's like, oh, what are you going to do with that English degree? Go serve coffee at Barnes & Noble the rest of your life. Yeah, because I knew someone who also did that. And yeah, people jive that they say bad things like that. He says, but people don't realize the actual power that there is in writing. He says, look, people, they read articles, they read books, and they wind up quitting their jobs or leaving their spouses, like making these big life changes. And I knew he was right, but then I did not experience this until, a few years ago when I was working actually with an old client of mine in the writing for hire sector of all things, who said to me, God, I've been reading Sonic Toad's blog, all your stuff on Gama Sutra, all these other things you've got out, and I just quit my job today. You inspired me to put in my 2 weeks notice. And I just sat there going, holy you mean to tell me, like, that actually happened? And the same thing happens with a lot of games. Like, how many of us played a game that put a dream in us and made us want to do something, whether it was, traveling a lot. I know the Carmen Sandiego games did that for me. Even as an adult, I've just played a lot of games that, made me want to take more risks and, have more adventures, no pun intended. And so, people just, I think a lot of game developers, just like, because we get derision, just like writers, other creatives, we think that we don't have a lot of power with this medium, but we do, and we need to think about it. So this is just a small sampling of some of like my favorite stories I've seen in games. You may be familiar with some of these, some of them you may not have heard of. So Donut County is like, I think, the most well-known one, which I already spent some time discussing, that you're going around as a raccoon. It's full of a lot of really, funny scenes. It's got some pretty like heartwarming and heartbreaking stuff in it too. But it's a very simple linear narrative, which is in stark contrast to the game and featuring next to it if you really know all those old obscure AGS games, Donna, Avenger of Blood, go play it now. It is shockingly relevant to everything happening in America, even the parts about the vampires. It is all coming together. I'm seriously just in shock at like how much everything in this game is currently happening in the States, except I'm not gonna give spoilers, but there's this big showdown if you get the golden ending, and we need that showdown. But but that game though definitely made me think a lot about, about like relationships, about death, about fascism, about a lot of things. And then there's this other game, called Roommates, which it's a little like JRPG style visual novel by Winter Wolves, which I spent last summer playing when I took this bucket list trip to Japan. And then it's a really simple game, but it's actually got this deep narrative where you get like really, really attached to these characters. And then we have Shardlight, which unfortunately this template cut off the best quote that I was trying to get a picture of. Yeah, aristocrats don't give a rat's ass about anyone until their lights go out. So like all these games are definitely able to make people like have some kind of other lived experience that they may not have had and help cultivate empathy. And then, so this actually comes from some of the political organizing I've been involved with, like where we've been talking a lot in my DSA chapter about horizontalism, and I actually realized it somewhat applies to game narratives to an extent, and that like when you have like this vertical narrative, it can still branch. It doesn't have to be linear, but then you have these like massive epic game like The Longest Journey. And then I picked out The Cat Lady as another example because it's also a pretty long game that does have a few branches you could go off of. But then at the top of my head, for a good example of horizontalism in a game, that would be a game like Unavowed, or like if you want to go old school, Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, because you either have like these multiple paths that can change the gameplay differently, or they get you to the same point, but you're still playing it out differently with a new perspective or with a new approach. And that, I think, should be definitely a big goal of ours if we want to use games to help cultivate empathy. It's getting new perspectives, it's getting different approaches, instead of just falling into the same old comfort zones that we keep falling into. So once again, to get down to brass tacks, how can game narratives help foster empathy? And so obviously, the biggest one being that it's a way to live out stories that you just simply cannot do with other mediums. and it's not, and then giving the player choices that matter, and that these choices can either alter the final outcome materially, or it can just show you something different maybe every time that you play it. But most of all, it's a way that you can learn by doing without creating harmful consequences in the outside world. And that like games don't always have to be about showing us some like example of good morality, or some type of like what's the word I'm looking for, like like an Aesop, I guess. And that it can actually like games can also be a good way to like get in touch with your bad side, but without having any consequences in the outside world, but just showing how your choices in this digital world impacted people. But then the main thing we also need to really think about is also focusing on induced empathy opposed to dispositional, because I'm about to get into that. That was the wrong slide. Because induced empathy would be that like you are helping induce it onto people who do not have this type of empathy before, or just were not exposed to this type of experience. Whereas dispositional means that like you already have the disposition to think and feel thinking about others. And then so a way that we can really help make this happen is, of course, starting with like diverse characters, especially major characters. There's a wonderful speaker you should check out, Tanya DePass. She runs a Patreon, a program called I Need Diverse Games, that actually talks a lot about diversity in games. It's like I'm not gonna like get too into this, and because one thing I always like really took away from her talks was that diversity, cannot be optic, because you can say, oh, hey, we put a black person here, we put, a non-binary person, in this game. But like optics only goes so far. It helps to see, of course, a character who looks like you if you've been underrepresented, but you need to have these traits, interwoven with, with the characters or the actual story. Like, it needs to actually have an impact, be like, well, hey, this is how being in an underrepresented group is impacting how this person's story is playing out. And how do you get it? You have to use actual life experiences. You got to get out in the world, and we'll talk to people. Talk to someone who does not look like you. Sit down and actually listen to them. And then you put these very misunderstood perspectives and experiences front and center, because the whole point of like making these really awesome twisty game narratives is that we don't want the same old stories being told again. We have to get some new ones. And then of course making gameplay variegate with the option to fail. Like it goes along with the whole like learning that your actions can have consequences, but at least they're only happening in this digital world opposed to the real world. And yay, increased awareness accomplished. Okay, yeah, now here's the caveat slide I was referencing earlier. But wait. Oh, this is just a much kinder version of this slide. We've all seen those Steam reviews. There was a very good one highlighted for, I can't remember the name, I can't remember the title, but yeah, there's this game I saw in the back that I haven't had a chance to play yet that had the most wonderful Steam review calling it like leftist SJW Drek, and I'm like, okay, that's the game I gotta play. But now, so that's the thing. We have to cultivate empathy in the people who need it. Yeah, when we have a bunch of us SJWs chilling here talking about game narratives, well, that's the thing. How are we going to make sure these games also wind up in the right hands? And so, yeah, obviously we want to have a mix of active and passive experiences, because as we could see with the success, the games, like the Telltale series had even the success that Donut County had celebrated, it's that, so there's clearly space not only still for linear narratives. You don't have to make this huge, twisty, branching thing every single time, but that there also needs to be a mix of both, action and then some passivity to allow for people to really get into the narrative and pay attention to it, and having, the right balance of story and action. But then, most of all, though, like think about the experiences that these characters are having, how you're going to relate that to the player, and then for someone who is like having trouble empathizing with people, how can you make something that is incredibly relatable, but that's also not going to like basically hit them over the head with that message. And then the other thing we need to keep in mind is that, of course, you're not going to be able to reach everybody. Just like you can't make everybody happy, you can't reach every single person with the message, and you do have to accept that. With the best we can do is at least to try and get discussion spurred, because if you keep an ear to the ground, pay attention, to maybe trying to figure out why some people lack empathy, like what's like the root cause of this, then how can we inject that though into a narrative, without making people feel attacked necessarily. So instead of saying, oh, hey, you're an asshole, you don't have any empathy, what are you doing? There's ways that we have to try to work that into narratives, and spur discussion on like why people keep like defaulting to these mindsets, like going back to the thing at the very beginning, like people just people construe, like kindness and empathy is giving money to charity, when no, it doesn't work that way. And yes, and so I don't know if there's time for Q&A, but that's the end of this talk.
You actually, I don't know why I'm whispering into the microphone.
Right in front of everybody.
Between you and me, Rachel, what do you think of these guys? You finished a little bit early. If you'd like to do a couple of questions.
Yeah, why not?
Okay, so do we have any questions from the room?
I see one person.
I'll run the mic up to you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. And I wanted to ask you, is it not a risk to develop a game with that kind of empathy and not being able to send it to people who don't have that kind of empathy in order for them to have it afterwards? I mean, how do you reach people who don't have that kind of empathy, but that you maybe want to reach? Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I think it's a risk that we just all take when we put a game out there, because you just never know how people are going to receive it. So I think that it's better that we at least try to do it, tell the story that we want to tell. And then once more discussion surrounding it is taking place, then that's the time to start addressing, like, hey, well, how come people just don't have this type of empathy? What else can we do, as creators, as commentators, on improving this and moving it forward?
Thank you.
Time for one more question. I can see a hand here. I'll just turn the mic
okay, yeah, I
across.
can't. These lights are so bright, I can't really.
Hi, thank you for your talk. A lot of games put the player at the center of the experience and give them a lot of control over how the narrative plays out. Do you feel like this is a risk to teaching players empathy by teaching them that they can control their environment in a way that maybe isn't possible among real living human beings who all have their own agency? And how do you counteract that, if so?
That's a good question, and I mean, once again, it depends on the exact type of game that you're designing, because you can also have, a first-person game where you are essentially the player. There's also third-person point and clicks where you are controlling another character, and I don't know. So it's I don't know. It's a lot to get into, because there's just so many different possibilities, for how you can play out a narrative these days, like how a person can take control of that. But it's just important, though, I think, to more or less to at least show these different types of experiences. But the main risk is just that we have to get it out there in the first place, because hey, how else are people going to start talking about some of these things? And I think that we're seeing games that take a lot more risk now with the types of stories and experiences that just haven't been told before. And it's still in a sense, I know that there's some pejorative around this term. The game itself can still be a sort of safe space, to explore difficult issues or riskier narratives, if I'm making sense there.
I think that's all the time we have. Thank you very
Okay.
much. Please join me in
Thanks for
thanking
coming.
Rachel Presser.